the Ivy Creek community for a long time, working in the Geographic Information Systems for over 13 years. And as a local Charlottesville resident since 2005, he brings a strong interest in local history and enjoys using maps and special technology to better understand Albemarle County and how it's changed over the years. For those of you who have heard Erik before, you will know that we are in for an enormous treat. It's just a wonderful, wonderful way to think about the history of Ivy Creek and the Ivy Creek today. So without further ado, Erik Irtenkauf.
All right, well, thank you so much, Chris. I appreciate that. I'm just gonna turn on my, share my screen here. All right, so again, thank you for that introduction. Thank you to the Education Committee and to the Foundation for having me here today. I really appreciate it. And thank you to everybody who came out today. I think, you know, Ivy Creek is really a special place. And the fact that so many people are here today to learn more about it, I think is a testament to just how special it is. I hope that today's presentation will help you appreciate Ivy Creek Natural Area in a new or maybe just a different way, and kind of better understand how when you're at Ivy Creek, whether you're walking the trails or you're watching nature or you're watching your kids run around, you're in a place that's in a part of a bigger story. And the historical landscape really isn't that far away. One thing I do want to mention before I dive in here is that this presentation draws heavily on research and resources that have been acquired and provided and shared by other individuals and organizations. So I've tried to include credits on all the slides and at the end, but absolutely, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here for this presentation. So with that, we'll go ahead and away we go. So just to give you an idea of the kind of the timeline that we'll be talking about here, today we're going to span really from the end of the Civil War, so about 1865, all the way to the late 70s into the early 80s. We'll start briefly, again, as far back as the Civil War period, and then we'll end at the time that the natural area is just coming into formation, originally known as the Rand Preserve before becoming Ivy Creek. These are pictures of some of the main stars of our narrative. For those of you who don't know the Ivy Creek, kind of the history of Ivy Creek or Riverview Farm, just give a brief introduction to these folks, because this is really, for the most part, this is really their story. This was their home, and this is the story of them and what they built. So Hugh Carr was born enslaved around 1843, and he was born actually just up the road from Ivy Creek at Woodlands Plantation. After the end of the Civil War, and the end of slavery, he began purchasing land, and by the time he passed away, his Riverview farm spanned over 100 acres. And that land, a lot of that land would go on to become the core of Ivy Creek Natural Area today. He was the largest landowner in the Union Ridge community, and he was one of the largest, if not the largest, African-American landowner in Albemarle County. His second wife was Texie Mae Hawkins, and they had 6 daughters and a son that they raised on the farm. Sorry, I lost my track there. So they raised their 7 children on the farm. Their oldest daughter was Mary Louise Carr. So we see her on the right here. In 1913, she married Conley Greer, and they took over for the responsibility for Riverview Farm after Hugh Carr passed away. They also amassed and bought and sold a considerable quantity or amount of land over the years. Conley was also the first Black extension agent in Albemarle County. So his job took him all around the county, working with African-American farmers, helping them to improve their farms and their agricultural practices. And he used Riverview Farm as a model for really modern agriculture best practices. He would bring people out and show them sort of the new and best ways of doing things. So his wife, Mary Carr Greer, oldest daughter of Hugh Carr and Texie Mae Hawkins, she was an educator at the nearby Albemarle Training School, or ATS. She was a prominent part of the African American educational community, and she served for decades as a teacher and principal at ATS. If you're familiar with Greer Elementary School, it's named in her honor. So we'll end today in the late 1970s, and we'll talk about that transition from Riverview Farm to a protected natural area. And that all occurred after Mrs. Greer passed away in 1973. So for the purposes of today, though, I do want to add just two other dates to the timeline. And both of them occur in the mid-1930s. In 1935, we have the first really detailed USGS topographic map for this portion of Albemarle County. And in 1937, we have the first known aerial photo of the area. So those are instrumental for understanding what the landscape looked like in those time periods, but that also means that there's a lot of history that happened before that that we don't always have good evidence for. So we're going to try to fill in some of those blanks today, but just keep in mind as we're going through this that, you know, from a bird's eye perspective, our sources are relatively recent. So with all that said, let's start at the beginning of our story, at the beginning of the timeline, going back to the Civil War era in Albemarle County. So this is a map from 1864. It was done by Confederate engineers who were dispersed across the countryside. They were making maps of a variety of counties in Virginia where battles might potentially occur. So you'll note in the middle of the screen here, we have the hydraulic mills. And we have some reddish lines representing roads. We have some these little circles look like happy little clouds or trees. And these lines here are called Hatchery Lines, representing terrain or slope. So you'll also notice, if you look, that there are some names written here in kind of an italic handwriting. Those are names of prominent landowners in the county. Notice how spaced out they are, right? Many owned large tracts of land and that were maintained by enslaved labor. So although these were typically, wealthy, prominent individuals, they actually didn't have a lot of liquid assets in many cases. Their wealth was tied up in land and slaves. So then with the economic ruin of the Civil War combined with the lack of free labor to then maintain that land, a lot of these planters, they fell on hard times, and the estates and the plantations had to be broken up and were sold off, which works out well because you also have this new large population of emancipated free African Americans who need places to live. So what happens in a lot of cases is that they start buying tracts of land on the edges of these plantations, and they start forming small communities. If we jump ahead then to, say, something like 1942, here we're looking at an area of Albemarle County, and the grayish little squiggly squares and polygons represent land parcels that are owned by African Americans. You can see that in some cases there are kind of individual and land parcels off by themselves, but for the most part, they're clustered in these tighter communities. You see these really intense clusters of smaller tracts together, forming these communities. Now, this is only in the data we're looking at here is only within Albemarle County. It doesn't include the city of Charlottesville. I'll talk a little more about the data behind this later, and that's just because what we have data for today. Is that all of these tracts are African American land. The area with you see some crosshatches or little square, little grids on them. Those are areas where we have holes in the data, and more than likely they're assumed to be African American, or at least predominantly African American, but the data is not perfect. But you do, overall, you see these communities, and you see this data that, even though it's from the early 40s, is certainly applicable in theme to previous decades in terms of the general sense of these tight-knit communities rising up and forming. In fact, many of them had churches and schools in them or nearby. And many of them had unique names, right? So these were names, in some cases, they're names that you may be familiar with. In some cases, probably not. In some cases, these were existing villages that these communities sort of sprang up or coalesced in. In others, these are, these are new names. These are new places that really developed. So some of these names you'll find on old maps, but not on maps anymore. Some of these never made it onto the map at all. But nonetheless, they were, I think in every sense, we can think of most of these places as being, their own unique, true places with a sense of community there. So for the purposes of the rest of our talk, now let's focus a little bit on these particular communities here: Hydraulic, Webland, Georgetown, and Cartersburg. They're located here, kind of in the center of the county, just north of Charlottesville. So if we go ahead and we'll zoom in there, and now we're looking at a map from. This is that topographic map from 1935. So we can see the Union Ridge area. That's what this collection of communities was known as. You see that we have Route 29 labeled as Seminole Trail running through the center of the map. Even back in 1935, that road name existed. We also have the Ravana River up here. Not a reservoir yet, it's still the river, but it's there. And we have in the green and white checkered line here, this is Ivy Creek Natural Area, or where it will be or is today. So just to give you a sense of context there. The communities themselves ran from, so the Georgetown community started in the lower left corner of the map here. This is the modern day Barracks Road, and it kind of intersects with Georgetown Road today. And these communities would span, kind of followed along the road, spanning all the way up towards Hydraulic and the Ravana River in more or less a continuous stretch. If we fast forward to a modern day view today, just to give you an idea of what the area looks like, or to further orient you, you'll see, again, we have Route 29. We have now the Ravana Reservoir. This is where 29 crosses the river. So the Doubletree Hotel would be back in here. Here's Ivy Creek Natural Area in the green. The new Berkmar extension that crosses the river near the dam, which would be right here. So this is where we're at today, and really where our story is taking place. And this is with those communities overlaid here. So, there was this combination of, I mean, quite a lot of different property owners, a lot of people in this relatively small area. And so I think, I mean, the fact that you have so many unique names here of communities, I think also really talks to probably how rich the area must have been, just in terms of kind of that sense of community, that atmosphere that, like I said, they each developed their own little kind of pockets of names and identities. And of course, a lot of these names, even though the place doesn't necessarily feel like a tight-knit community today, when you, if you drive around, you still see literal signs of them in a lot of places. So just reminders of what communities were there. So if we come back to our modern context here, I think, one thing that's not always clear when you're looking at this is primarily thanks to Route 29 today, just how much traffic would have been moving through this area in the past. I think this would actually have been a pretty hopping place. If we were to, let's transition back in time again, except now let's go back to 1867. So this is a map done by a man named Jedediah Hotchkiss. We actually have a photograph of him. He's an engineer and a map maker. He served in the Confederate Army as well. And he made this map just a few years after the end of the Civil War. What I like about it here is that, so we see the road lines running across the map, and the blue squiggles here are the Ravana River, but it makes very clear, it's very easy to focus on the roads themselves. Obviously, we're centered on hydraulic mills here in big letters. I mean, this was the prominent, those mills were the prominent feature in the area at the time. But so we have all these roads running right through here. And if we put modern road labels on them, you get a sense of how the modern roads are in most cases track the location of these roads even as far back as the Civil War era or earlier. This road, which is today partially Rio Road and then blends into Woodburn Road before crossing up the Ravana River, this was one of the major routes in and out of Charlottesville, actually. So it would leave Charlottesville, it would come up here, you would cross the Ravana. There was a bridge next to what was then Rio Mills. And then it would keep on going up north towards Earlysville. It would pass where the airport is today. It would become Buck Mountain Road and then eventually turn into Simmons Gap, leaving the county. So this is the route actually that Custer took, leading to the Battle of Rio Hill, which occurred right in this area. So, it's no coincidence that the battle occurred there when you look at it in terms of the road network. I think it's kind of interesting. I mean, he wasn't bumping around the back roads. He was taking the main road into town when that happened. Today, that'd be the equivalent of maybe coming down Route 29 or I-64. So, and then we also have, looking at some of these other roads, we have, this is modern day hydraulic road, and then it turns into, this is not labeled, but it's actually Lambs Road. So Albemarle High School would be over here, and it would come in, this was called, this was the original Barracks Road, leading to the location where the Revolutionary War prisoners were kept. But today it's known as, eventually the Lambs Road ends, and Old Barracks Road would continue, and it's not in use anymore. But the takeaway here is that if we drop those these communities back on here, again, you see that really just from a geographic perspective, I think one of the things that makes the community unique is that, I mean, it was so close to Charlottesville, it was centrally located, it was near these hydraulic mills, and you just had so much traffic and so many roads running through them. I think that really would have contributed to that must have contributed to the atmosphere in those communities. I mean, like I say, there must have been just a lot of traffic, a lot of movement, and I think that probably fed into some of what made those communities such a vibrant place. And again, there's with the modern perspective. But now let's go ahead and let's zoom in, and we'll look at the hydraulic area a little closer, in the area around Ivy Creek. So here we are. We're obviously, we see the Ivy Creek natural area next to the South Fork Ravana Reservoir. We've got Earlysville Road running up, leading towards the reservoir. And if you were driving to Ivy Creek from town, you would come down Earlysville Road and you would turn a left into the natural area. We have Hydraulic Road and Rio Road down here. They intersect at this intersection. This is Union Ridge Baptist Church. This is the Latter-day Saints Church, and across the street is Summers store, which is closed now. But that's that intersection, just to give you a frame of reference. Over here we have Route 29. We have the Rio Hill Shopping Center. There's the Kroger. This would be the Lowe's. And we have Agner Hurt Elementary School, along with Woodburn Road and Berkmar Road. So that's sort of, we'll be coming back to this view a few times during the rest of the talk. So I just wanted to walk through that. Because if we were to kind of roll the clock back a little bit to a time in the late 1800s, it would look a little different. And I'm just going to toggle back and forth here a few times. We'll start. I mean, the big thing you probably notice is that what is the reservoir today is a river back in, say, the late sort of cross section of time in the late 1800s. Right, we still have the river. Also, we have a road, Rio Road, used to continue on to Woodburn before it went over and crossed at Rio Mills. The road would actually go straight through here, kind of running right through Agner Hurt Elementary School. So that was the path of the road at one time. Modern Earlysville Road doesn't exist yet. So the way to get to Hydraulic Mills then was taking this road that ran down towards it would run down towards the river, would track the river, and then ended up over at the mill site. And we'll look a little more closely at that in a minute. We also have the Union Ridge Graded School down here, which was the first name of Albemarle Training School, located right here in the community, and then Union Ridge Baptist Church, which still stands. The orangish areas here represent some prominent African-American landowners who are immediately adjacent to Hugh Carr. So he's shown in sort of in the center here with kind of the white shaded area. These are his land holdings. And this is really this is his Riverview farm. And in the dashed green lines, we see Ivy Creek Natural Area. And so you see how that really the core of his farm would lead itself to becoming Ivy Creek. He also owned some land over in Cartersburg as well. You know, without going into, so we could do entire talks on just these individuals, and I know others have done some exceptional talks about them. So I won't go too much into the lives of these individuals today, but just to point out that they were such a group of interesting, dynamic, really successful individuals. You know, you had people that in some cases started life enslaved and went on to build lives in freedom and become successful businessmen. You had people who were educators and lawyers and doctors. You had people that were free people of color before the Civil War, and you know, found success in that type of what I can only imagine must have been an extremely harsh existence, being African American prior to, in the era of slavery, being free, that is, in the era of slavery. So just incredible individuals. And kind of in the middle here, you have Hugh Carr and his Riverview farm. And the individuals here that are labeled in these property lines, this draws heavily on research that Steve Thompson did. So I want to give him, he did a lot of painstaking research to locate these names and figure out exactly where they all were. But I think just understanding that there was this larger community around Riverview Farms is incredibly important. So in order to really understand I think the movement, or to understand the community, you need to understand a little bit about how the movement probably would have occurred around. You know, hydraulic mills was certainly a key attracting feature. And then again, you had the Union Ridge Baptist Church and the Albemarle Training School, or the Union Ridge Graded School originally down here. If we lay the new or the modern Earlysville Road on here, it just gives you an idea how, the way that we transit through the area today was a little bit different from how it was back then. More than likely, the current Earlysville Road wasn't built until the early 1900s. In 1906, there was some major legislation at the state level that led to a lot of new road construction. And what we do have is, you can see on this is a survey plat from 1917 that was taken after the death of Hugh Carr, as the land was being divided among his children. And we actually can see, we look at this area here and we zoom in and kind of rotate it, they've labeled here New Road. And so this is more or less the current Earlysville Road, and it became the dividing line for a lot of that property. And again, so that was 1917. So it seems somewhere between that, probably 1906, 1907 to 17, the current Earlysville Road existed, and it seemed fairly quickly, I think, Price supplanted the old road to hydraulic. And lot number 1, incidentally, here, this is the property that would become that Mary Carr Greer received, and where she and Conley Greer lived and farmed, and has the farmhouse and the cemetery. So it's kind of cool because you can see still today that old, the trace of that old hydraulic road, the old road to hydraulic, when you cross the reservoir today. If we go forward one more. So if you've ever noticed, when you're driving across the bridge, this is a modern, down here on the bottom, this is a modern aerial photo. You'll see a little indentation in the landscape. If you're coming down the bridge from Earlysville, the airport would be up this way. You come down the bridge, you might see a little indentation in the shoreline in the reservoir. And that's actually where the old road to hydraulic mills came out. It would come out, this image is from 1937. So you would drop down, you would come out, and you would follow the riverbank, and you would end up near where the river was, where the hydraulic mills were. And so this photo here, taken from the bridge, kind of spanning the scene here, you can see where that road would have looked like. If you took it up here, you would have kept going up the hill and through the woods, and you would have come out at the Union Ridge Baptist Church or Albemarle Training School. Or if you came down this way, you would take it across, and you would end up at the hydraulic mill site, which was located near where this other bridge is today. So just something to notice, a little bit of the landscape that still does remain, even with the reservoir there. So as we move forward in time now, let's leave the late 1800s and let's head to 1937. Right. So like I said before, this is a special time because we happen to have a couple of different data sets that come together here. We have that USGS topographic map from this time, and we have the first aerial photo, the first known aerial photo of Riverview Farm. Also in 1942, the county did a comprehensive property map that included things like property boundaries, the name of the owner, and thanks to the Jim Crow era, also the race of the owner. So thanks to that information, though, that helps us visualize this African-American owned property circa 1942, which is what we're looking at here today. We're looking at today is that data from 1942. All of the orange parcels here represent African-American owned land. So you can see the Webland area, which continued down below. This is Hydraulic Road today. You see the Cartersburg area. So just really, excuse me. If we go forward a little bit, just to give you a sense of how the landscape has changed. You get a sense of all that development down here. So we have that area. So now let's go ahead and let's zoom in on, let's take a little bit closer look here at actual Ivy Creek Natural Area. So we will zoom in, and this is what it looks like today. This is Earlysville Road. So you would come down Earlysville Road and you would turn left. If you're coming from town, you would turn left into it, and here's we have the parking lot. If you kept going down the road, you would get to the reservoir, and this would take you across and up towards the airport. And this way would take you to Woodlands Road. On the within the area itself, we have the farmhouse, and we have, this is the barn. Excuse me, this is the barn right here. We have the farmhouse over here. If we roll back the clock a little bit, though, we can see what it looked like in 1937, a little bit different. And what we can do is we can dive in a little bit deeper here now, kind of walk through this image and really sort of explore a little bit what Riverview Farm would have looked like. Again, circa 1937 in the, this would be the Conley Greer, Mary Carr Greer era. So the first thing you'll notice is we have the Ravana River over here, and the dashed bluish line here indicates the extent of the reservoir that was created in the 60s. But so all of this area today is now underwater. The solid black line that you see here, this represents this is the property line in 1937 owned by the Greers. A few years later in 1940 and then in 47, they would purchase these parcels of land as well. And of course, the 1940 parcel here was originally owned by Hugh Carr as well. We have the farmhouse. The driveway would come in from Earlysville Road, but it would stay to the right of the farm. The parking area today is over here. The road would come up here to the right. The cemetery is located over here. You can't really see it, but it's there. Up here we have what looks like this is the site of the barn, and the barn appears to be under construction. There's just a lot of activity. You can see the ground looks like it's fairly disturbed, and there's, but you could still make out a nice rectangular shape. So it looks like this is probably the barn in some stage of construction. There's also 2 orchards on the farm. So we see these nice, really nice straight lines of trees and plants. That's an orchard. So there's this one here behind the barn and another one over in this area today. If you walk back in this area, you'll still see some signs of the orchard. You can see kind of the raised hill of the rows of trees. Each row kind of a little slightly raised. So you can still see that today, and there are a few places where you can see fruit growing in the area. This was taken back near the back of the barn. So if you're if you're walking around back there and you see some fruit growing or on the ground, that's a direct link back to the back to the time of the Greers, if not earlier. There's also the trash dump was located over here. So Conley Greer had, in addition to working the farm and being an extension agent, he also would haul, he had some contracts to haul trash and food waste from some institutions in town at UVA and hotels. And he would recycle the food scraps for his pigs. So the dump is over here, and you can kind of imagine he might have come down the road with his horse and trailer and brought it around back here. And then up in the top, we see what's labeled the tenant house. So this was a small building that was rented out, and people would live there and would help maintain the farm. And that, you can imagine, that was helpful when Conley Greer, as an extension agent, spent a lot of time on who'd been out on his horse, going around to all the farms, would have been away for days at a time in some cases. So having an extra set of hands, you can imagine, must have been helpful. One other thing I wanted to mention is the hay rake. So you may recall seeing this if you visited the natural area and you've walked down the paved trail and you come across this. And I remember the first time I saw it, I was a little surprised, just because you feel like you're out for a walk in the woods and then suddenly you see this piece of farm equipment and you're like, what's the story there? But what's interesting is that I don't have it layered on the map here, but if I show you, I'll show you where it is and it'll make perfect sense. So you can see that the hay rake really nicely aligns as either basically parked probably on the side of this old farm road here at Riverview Farm. And then if we add some layers now for the trails and for the parking lot, you get a sense of really now how the modern landscape starts intersecting with the historic landscape. You can see as you're out walking the trails, as you're really walking across these fields, you're walking through these orchards, you're walking across this historic landscape. One other thing I wanted to just mention real quick is that so like I said, Conley Greer worked as an extension agent. He was the first African-American agent in the county. And actually a local history researcher, Jane Smith, a while back, she came across an article from 1950 that described a farm tour that Conley Greer had arranged to some of the farms, presumably that he would have been working at and assisting. So if we go forward one, so this is the same base map that we saw earlier. This is all of those African-American communities. And if we look at the article here from 1950, I'll just read the beginning. A tour of farms and farm homes was held in Albemarle County recently under the direction of C.G. Greer, county agent. The tour began at Riverview, home of Mr. and Mrs. Greer. And then it goes on and it lists this name of houses or farmers that the group stopped to visit at. And so by plotting those out and then looking at the route that they took, you start getting a sense of maybe some of the areas where, Conley Greer, making his rounds as the extension agent, that he was probably interacting with and passing by, some of the individuals and some of the communities that he must have come across in his time era. You can see the group would have gone up towards Earlysville, past where the airport is about here today, make their way around and then down Burnley Station Road. And then the article says they visited the farm of Thornton Brock and then stopped for lunch at the house of Mr. Smith. And that's right near this community that some sources identify as being called Woodville. We can actually zoom in, and this is an aerial photo from the UVA Special Collections Library from 1957. And, we can see the farm of Mr. Brock. You can see the fields. You can see some of the buildings. And so, you really get a sense of, you can also see the neighboring African-American owned property here. You get a sense of what this community must have been like at that time. Also, as I said, the article says they stopped at the home of Mr. Smith for a picnic lunch. Sure enough, there's a Morris and Julie Smith right across the road where I assume they probably stopped at. And so you get a sense too, the group, making the rounds, stopping, having lunch, and then they get back on the road and continue. They would have gone probably down Stony Point, past these communities of Petersburg and Foster's and Eastham. And then they ended up at the farm of Mr. George Yates. So unfortunately, his farm is just off the edge of this map, but we do have it on another map. So you can see where the group would have ended up in your Boyd's Tavern, the border of Albemarle and Fluvanna. And you can imagine they probably finished here because then it was easy to hop on 250 and head home. So just, I love this article just because I think it's kind of just gives some interesting insight into what a little bit of Conley Greer's life outside of the farm. So if we return now back to Riverview though, and back to Ivy Creek, this is how it looked in 1937. And we flash forward 20 years to 1957. In this case now, we can see the barn is now complete. A few little buildings have sprung up over here. But this is an important image because Conley Greer passed away in 1956. So this is about a year, just about a year after he passed away. So it really gives us a good idea of what kind of, what the farm looked like at the end of his era. It gives us a good idea of potentially, what things he would have had a hand in creating and developing, and how things looked when he when his era on the farm sort of, we transition out of that. So if we zoom in a little bit and we look at this collection of aerial photos now, we're looking just at the farmhouse area, and I've stacked them all together here to make it a little easier to do some comparisons in the different eras. I'm going to start in 2018 just because being more recent, that's I think it'll be a little easier to situate ourselves. We have Earlysville Road here, and then this is again the driveway into the natural area. The black outline, the Earlysville Road and the driveway coming into Ivy Creek natural area. This is the farmhouse, again with the black line indicating kind of the footprint. And we've got some of the outbuildings here. This is the education building, where we would be in different circumstances giving this talk. But this is the education building, and we have the barn up here at the top of the image. And then this is the restroom building, and this is actually the information kiosk. So if we go back to 1937, we'll see that the world was a little fuzzier back then, apparently. But the driveway coming in at that time, instead of coming down and to the left, it stayed to the right of the house and would have come back here and continued on past the barn and hanging a left behind the barn, with this is the orchard area up here. If we look at 1951 now, we can see that a variety of small buildings have popped up, kind of outbuildings between the farmhouse and the barn. You also see that the driveway now extends to the left of the house. So it comes around, and it would make sense to be accessible to those outbuildings. If we look at the 1970 image, we can still see those buildings. In fact, there's been one little addition here. And you can see the driveway still comes to the left. Also, there's been a little deviation now. A new track has opened up to the south, giving you kind of a more straight line if you were coming into the farm, up the hill and around, as opposed to having to take the curve. You can also see over here, this is the current path of Earlysville Road, and this is the older path. It was been realigned slightly, and you can still see that today, but here it's much more recent. The 1970 photo is great because it does a good job of capturing that earlier era. As I say, a lot of, there's many similarities to the way the farm looked in 1950, but you have benefits of being a more recent image. It's just a little sharper and you can pull more details out. So let's go ahead and dig into that image a little bit deeper. So now, hope I'm not giving anybody whiplash or making anybody seasick or anything, but now we've zoomed in a little more, and also north is no longer up. So I've tilted the image just to make it a little bit easier and make better use of the screen real estate. So north is going that way. We have again, the driveway leading in. Here's the parking lot. We have the farmhouse here, the education building, and the barn. You can actually see some people standing around here. So this is a really great photo. You can also see the cemetery here, and you can actually see the individual grave markers. So if we float back to 1970, though, you get a sense of how the landscape used to look. So one great thing that we have, just an amazing resource, is that about a year ago, the foundation arranged a visit from a gentleman named Manfred Jones, who was a grandson of Conley Greer and Mary Carr Greer. And he actually lived and spent some time on the farm in the 1950s. So when he visited last year, they did a walk around outside, and he was able to share some of his recollections and explain, what things were in which places. And so we've been able to take his recollections, and in marrying that up with some of these photos, we have an idea actually of what we're really seeing in these images beyond just the buildings and the pixels that you're seeing here. So based on his descriptions, we can understand that obviously we have the farmhouse, but at one time there was another building back here, a little square building that was a canning shed. And I should mention here that lines that are in black, those are buildings that still exist, whereas red lines indicate something that no longer exists. So there was a canning shed behind the farmhouse. Mary Carr Greer would do a lot of canning in the house, and he told us how she would store things in the canning shed, and it was actually kind of half underground, so you would step down into it. And so we know that was over here. The shed and the 3-bay garage still exists today. Over here, we know that now, so we have a chicken coop, and there was a run-in shed, which was kind of a 3-sided building. It was open on one side that you could just sort of pull in equipment and things and get them out of the elements, but not completely protected. So that was here. And then there was a pig pen down near the end here. Also, he described a smaller pump house, and we know there were 2 buildings here. So we don't entirely have that figured out. We're not sure what the other building would have been, but it seems at least one of these was a pump house, which makes sense because he described how this area, this open area between the farmhouse and the barn, was a garden. Grow things like corn in the back, and then in the front half, melons and tomatoes and squash and things like that. So if we go forward, then we can take those outlines, and now we can drop them onto the current landscape, right? And so we can see where the canning shed used to be. It's interesting here. So the run-in shed almost perfectly encompasses the original information kiosk or education kiosk, and the new kiosk that was built just in the last, I think just last year. It's not on this image because this image is from 2018, but that would be right where the chicken coop was. So you can think about the chicken coop in the run-in shed the next time you're there reading some of the amazing signs and material that the education committee has put together, or picking up a trail map. So just really neat to kind of see this, to understand this area, I think a little bit better as, really as Conley Greer built it, and, as he and Mary Greer made their mark on the land, and as they understood it or would recognize it. So at this point, you're probably thinking, well, geez, Erik, this is really great, but this image is still kind of fuzzy, and it's hard to see things from straight down. And it'd be great if we could actually see what these buildings looked like a little more, a little better from the side, or maybe even if they were in color, that would be great. And so if you're thinking that, I would say, well, you're in luck, because we actually have a collection of photos that thanks to Dee Dee Smith, that she was aware of, and they were on slides. And so she digitized them. And what they are is it's a collection of photographs taken by volunteers in the very early stages of the natural area being developed. So they really, they capture very well what this landscape looked like just as it was transitioning from being a working farm to the natural area. And again, these are photographs. Literally, it looks like somebody just circling in an airplane, snapping pictures, but they're amazing. So with that, and again, thanks to the knowledge and hard work of Dee Dee, I now present to you Riverview Farm, circa 1979, in living color. So this is basically the same scene we were looking at. Just now we're looking at it, instead of looking at it from straight down, we're kind of looking at it from the side. So you can see the barn. You see we have the farmhouse here. This is Earlysville Road in the background. This is basically what it looks like today, Earlysville Road, that is. Come down here towards the reservoir. But now we can see not just the farmhouse, we see things like the chicken coop. We can see the run-in shed. We can see where, at least in this era, the pigs were kept. We can see probably the pump house and the little foundation pad from the second building. So again, in terms of bringing this landscape to sight and alive rather, I think that these photos are just an amazing resource. And we can see the canning shed also. Like I said, we know from Manfred's description that it was half underground, or you stepped down into it and you can see how short it is, kind of just sort of poking up above the ground. So just a really great resource for understanding the historical landscape. So as we move forward now, so this image on the left is from, again, circa 1979. And I'm comparing it here. The image on the right is, it's actually not a photograph. It's from, if you're familiar with Google Earth, I've used that to kind of recreate the view. So it's a computer model. And so that's why some of the trees look a little blotchy. But I think it does the job of hopefully helping to orient you to what we're looking at when you look at the historical photo. So, we can see really nicely the driveway leading in towards the farmhouse, and here's sort of the old path along with the newer straight path. We see the farmhouse, we see the canning shed. You can even see the front door on the canning shed. You see the chicken coop, you can see the door there. You can almost look into the run-in shed. Just you really get a sense of the landscape there, and comparing it to today, it's just it's amazing how fast things grow back and grow in, and just how much more tree growth an area there is in the area around the farmhouse today that would have been open back in the earlier years. So on the left this is the image we just saw, but on the right now is another photo from the collection, but it was taken a little bit later because, I'm not exactly sure, I think it was probably post 1980, but we can actually see that they're in the process of deconstructing some of these buildings that no longer exist. So we have the canning shed here. If we look here, you can actually see it looks like the walls are there, but the roof has come off. These buildings, the 3-bay garage and the other shed, are still here today. But if we look over here, we can see that the chicken coop is down. You can still see the foundation pads of the buildings, and the run-in shed have both been removed. And also now the second of the two little square, what I'm calling the pump house building, has been taken down. It's kind of interesting without knowing the backstory of why some buildings were deconstructed and others weren't, or what condition they were in. It is interesting to note that the buildings they took down were all the most recently built ones. So I can see maybe there was potentially a conscious decision to try to keep some of the older older buildings, because if you remember, a lot of the, these were the canning shed, the chicken coop, the run-in shed were all added kind of that post-1937 time frame. You can also, there might have been just more of a practical decision as well. If you're thinking about having a natural area with people wandering around, it probably makes a sense to not have buildings distributed all over the place where kids could stumble into or people could get into, and you have to keep up with maintaining or trying to take care of. So that's an option also. And you can also see in the second image, you can see very clearly the grave markers in the cemetery here. Here's another shot a little bit further out. This is probably about what the reservoir looks like this morning if we were out there today. A little iced over. And you can see how much more open it is around the farmhouse. And you can see how this area that's more open back in 1979 is starting, definitely being more grown in today. Another kind of higher shot just to give you that overall view. You can see where the parking lot would have been, or will be rather. It comes in right in here. And so we have this collection of shots. So the one in the top left is one you've probably seen before. It's one of my, I think probably my favorite of all the aerial photos of Riverview Farm, just because it's the oldest, but it captures, it's an older image, but it's still, you have this oblique view, so you can really see a lot of detail, but it captures such an earlier time, probably the 1950s, maybe the 60s. And you can see in the background here is, I mean, just as Manfred described, sort of in the back by the barn, you'd have corn growing, and then you had smaller crops growing towards the front here. Whether by coincidence or design, there's an aerial view from 1979, very similar in terms of perspective. And so that makes it easy to do some comparisons and look at how things changed, and I mean, really how similar things were in a lot of ways. You can see the major difference, other than the crops, is again, that second building is missing here, that's present there. And then just a modern view, just to give you a sense of kind of what this area looks like today. So you may be thinking now, well, gee, Eric, that's great. This is really cool, but what would be better is if we could actually get down and walk around and take a closer look at some of these buildings and see them up close. And if you're thinking that, then I would respond, well, you're in luck, because as part of that same set of photos that Dee digitized, we actually also have some photos from the ground. So I will go, we'll go in here, and now we can take these photos and we can compare them with kind of modern views today. And these will probably be a little easier to place than maybe some of the aerial views. But we have the farmhouse today on the right, and the farmhouse in 1979 over here. Kind of interesting. Not that certainly the vegetation has changed a bit, but it's still the farmhouse. We have a more up close view. Again, you can see, to me, I mean, I think that this slide really speaks to just all the great work the foundation is doing to restore the farmhouse. I mean, it looks spectacular in this image on the right. I mean, doesn't look, only looks better than actually than the image back in '79 in a lot of ways. So I think that really speaks to the work that the foundation is doing. The farmhouse. So now we can get out and we can walk around the property a little bit. So again, this is a view that honestly isn't terribly different today than it was. This is the farmhouse back here. This is the 3-bayed garage. This is the driveway when you drive in to Ivy Creek today. You can see how the old driveway would come around and it would still just sort of wrap around, make their way around here to the front of the house. So now we're basically in almost the same spot, but now we've turned around. So now we're looking at, this is the two education kiosks. So this is the original one, and this is the newer one that was just built. And you can see they're right where essentially where the chicken coop is today. So you can see in the corner, the side of the image here, you can just make out the garage building over there. But this is the same spot. And then this is the parking lot back in here. So it's also interesting just how as the trees have grown in and the vegetation has matured, you know, no longer, you used to have a view of the mountains there, which is kind of interesting. So if we walk forward a little bit, we're a little closer now to the two kiosks. And now you can see really nicely how they compare with, again, that chicken coop and the run-in shed. So they're right there. So you can think of that next time you visit. And I mean, I love what it implies about. I mean, this is just a good natural spot in any era, right, to put a building, right? If you're coming in through this way, it just is a good sensical level, accessible spot to put things. You can also see, we see the barn back here, and then you can see where the little, again, what I call the pump house building would be right around over here. There's also a very conveniently placed tree here. I don't know if these are the same tree or not. That is so far out of my area of expertise. I would think this one might be a little bigger, but it sort of looks similar, and it looks to be in the right spot. So if you were at Ivy Creek last week and you saw a weirdo just staring very intently at this tree, that was me. There was nothing to be alarmed about, but I was trying to decipher clues there. But it would be interesting, I think, for somebody more knowledgeable in plants and trees to maybe look at some of these photos and see if you can ID anything that is still present or still around today that was here in this era. Because I mean, it was mostly open, but there are a few things. So as we move a little further along, we're getting closer to the barn now, and we have a much better view of that pump building. And again, that would have been, right around in here. I think there's some bird feeders and things right over here here today. So now we're looking at the back of the farmhouse. You can see that other than, there's a line of trees growing in, but other than that, I mean, the profile doesn't look dramatically different. There's no laundry hanging out to dry. But otherwise, you can see where this is a great shot of that, again, of Mrs. Greer's canning shed. And you can see how it's kind of built into the ground. And, it's right here where, on the outside corner, kind of where this plant is today. And then, so finishing up, there's actually, again, whether it was by coincidence or design, there's two photos taken from near the barn, looking back towards the house that actually you can overlap and you get kind of a panoramic scene. And I think from the perspective, I spent a while trying to replicate this look and finally realized that it was probably elevated. So it's probably somebody on a ladder or maybe even on the upper level of the barn looking out. So you can imagine they might have, but we can overlay them and you get kind of a broader sense of the landscape. And so this is from the barn looking back and, generally the same field of view today, about 40 years later. So as we conclude our tour here, this is Ivy Creek Natural Area circa 1980. this aerial photo. Again, you can see the barn. Like I said, the image is definitely from sometime in 1980, and it really looks like it looks like, you know, there's still something here where the chicken coop and the run-in shed were. So it looks like those were taken down. So that other aerial photo I showed you of the deconstruction was probably post 79. But that's what it looked like in 1980. If we flash forward to 1990 now it's starting to look like the Ivy Creek that probably we all would recognize. The parking lot is in place. And then we would finish up here with the modern view today. So just by way of wrapping up, just again, a couple of extra special thanks to people who knowingly or unknowingly contributed to this talk. And I specifically want to recognize Steve Thompson, who's done an amazing amount of research in this area, especially the old landowners. He actually provided the 1937 aerial photo, which finding one of that quality is very difficult to find. And some of the other subsequent aerial photos that we saw. So without, and he's just been incredibly gracious and kind with sharing his knowledge and resources. So really without him, there probably wouldn't have been a presentation. And likewise, without D.D. Smith and these aerial photos and the ground photos, we wouldn't have a presentation either. So definitely thank you to all of those individuals for helping, like I said, helping knowingly or unknowingly with fleshing this out, or with helping in my understanding, which helped me put this together. So I appreciate that. And that takes me to the end here. So I'll be happy to take some questions. Thank you to everyone who's hung in there through this. But yeah, I'd love to hear questions. And if not, I'd love to hear from you at any time in the future if you want to talk further or want additional information or anything like that. So that I will pull out of, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Chris, should I kick it back to you? Oh, you're still muted.
There you go.
Thank you, Eric. That was wonderful. I think Sue is now going to handle the questions. Sue?
Gotcha. I mean, I can see them also if
you want to just
an easier way to go through.
Jump in.
Okay, so I'm just going to go back and start, and so in some ways we'll revisit parts of the talk. So there's a question about the names of the plantations and where they were located. There's a variety of maps that tell us those, actually tell us some of those locations, or tell us the names of them, and we know where a lot of them were. Again, the Woodlands plantation where Hugh Carr was born is actually just up, believe it or not, Woodlands Road. If you drive past Ivy Creek and go through the reservoir, and you can see the old barns and whatnot, it's there on the left. We do have some other maps, and I've done some other mapping. I won't go into here of those locations, but they are available. And if someone wanted to reach out separately, I could provide more information, or a lot of that. I mean, the Historical Society too has a lot of resources on that. Oh, but I would just say also that, I mean, they were everywhere in the area. I mean, it wasn't just kind of this is the plantation section, or this is, this was the agriculture section, right? I mean, this is pretty much, I mean, everywhere. And I mean, most modern subdivisions, you're living on area that was farmland, or that more than likely, enslaved labor maintained in some form at some point. So the cemetery was just for the family. I know it was left in Hugh Carr's, I think it was his will that I think a section of the property is left off for family burials. I think there are five known burials, but there are 5 marked burials, but there are also some grave markers that look like earlier markings that we're not exactly sure who. We have some ideas about who might be there, but we don't know for sure. So it is a bit of we know a little bit, but it is a bit of a mystery, and I am not the expert on that by any means. So I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in and say more on that, but it is just a family cemetery. So Lorna asked about in 37 and previous how the cars would get from hydraulic road to the dump. So that would have been just around the farm. They would have gone kind of from the farmhouse towards, if you were to stand on the side of the farmhouse towards Earlysville Road and just walk towards past the education building on your right towards the barn, the old road would have gone down there, and it would have taken a left behind the barn, and then you would go down the hill, and the dump is down there. I forget which trail it's off of, but it would be back in there. John asked a great question about what tree species were in the orchards. That I'm not even going to hazard a guess on. I'm guessing somebody has done some research on that. I don't know if Alice or Steve have some ideas, but I don't know. I'm not sure about several trash dumps. I'm just familiar with the one. It may have been scattered over an area a bit, but and I know there's been a little bit of archaeological work there, and they've they found some remnants, old plates and utensils and things like that probably from the different cafeterias and whatnot. But I'm not the expert to speak on that. And one in the field by the. Oh, that's Karen. Karen, if you want to jump in, by all means. I'm not sure about.
That one I heard about closer to when the foundation was being founded, and there was just a big pile out in the field of metal things, and it was high and it was really difficult. It wasn't just hotel dregs, it was machinery in part.
Right.
That's what I heard, I think from Steve or Dee Dee possibly. And it took a lot of work to clear it out, apparently. And then Adele mentioned something past the white oak tree.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sorry. That I'm honestly not sure about. Again, that's something I'll have to look into. The farm tour, yeah, all the farms on the tour were owned by African Americans. And again, I mean, we're presuming because, knowing Conley Greer's job, I mean, these were farms that he interacted with, and he probably would have wanted to highlight. It would be interesting to have known a little more about what was said on those tours or at those farms and presented. So we do have some information on the population of Black residents in the different communities at the height of Black land ownership. Like I say, that could be its own presentation, and I didn't go too far. I didn't want to go down a rabbit hole. I will, let me see if I can actually. I was going to say, we do know a little bit. If just going to pull up a slide again. So we know some of the individuals here. So we have Hugh Carr in the center. So immediately next to Riverview Farm was Berkeley Bullock, who just, I mean, an amazingly interesting individual, because he started his life enslaved, but he went on to become just a really successful businessman. He owned a restaurant at the Union Station, so the train station. And he was also one of the founders of something called the Piedmont Industrial and Land Improvement Company, which helped African Americans purchase homes. You know, at that time in particular, property ownership was really seen as a means for upward mobility and development. So, you know, he was part of this effort that helped a lot of people purchase land. And also played a part in the Union Ridge Baptist Church. Someone else I'd highlight is just Jesse Sammons. So he's just an amazingly interesting individual. So his father was Rollins Sammons, who actually was a miller and a co-owner of the hydraulic mills. And so he spent time growing up or living at the mills. His father was what's called a free person of color. So he's one of those people who, in the era of slavery, even though being African American or being not white, was still free. So he was born free. He was an educator, and he taught at the Union Ridge Graded School, and then ATS. He was the first principal. He was also active in the political scene. So he was a candidate for a seat to the General Assembly. That candidacy was kind of voted down by folks who felt that it was a little too soon to have an African-American person running for office. That was in, I think, 1880. But still, I mean, just a very prominent member of the community. Those were just a few. Like I said, I mean, there's been a lot of research done into that. If you again, I mean, the easiest thing, if you do some searches for just Union Ridge or hydraulic in Albemarle, you can find some additional resources, and there's some resources on the Ivy Creek website as well.
Erik, can I interrupt here? This is Dee Dee.
Yeah.
And I just want to note, because of the audience, probably a lot of people remember this. It was Jesse Sammons' family cemetery that was found in the path of the Western Bypass in 2013. That was the last nail in the coffin of the Western Bypass. But I just wanted to note that. And his family story, his family story was found eligible for national recognition for its significance to particularly African-American life after emancipation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Dee Dee. Yeah, I mean, it is just an amazing, I mean, the more you start reading it, yeah, it's an amazing story. And his house is still standing there if you drive down Lamb Road. I'm not sure, and actually it looks like it's been painted recently. It looks very nice. But yeah, that was all right there in the path of the bypass. So sorry, I'm gonna just keep rolling with the questions. So a question about how the economic impact of these communities and farms to the growth of Albemarle County. Yeah, that's a good question. I don't offhand have any information on that, but that would be something to certainly to look into. I don't have anything on that, but I mean, they did, you know, they were certainly a part of it, and a lot of, you know, I mean, you had a lot of changes going on in society as kind of the movement away from agriculture. So, I mean, it wasn't uncommon that, you know, you'd have people start taking other jobs, but they'd still maintain farms on the side, or, you know, smaller gardens and whatnot as well. Oh, was it typical to have a cemetery and garden so close to each other? Crystal asks. Again, that I haven't seen enough of these to know if anybody wants to jump in there. Yeah, obviously it was a smaller family cemetery, so, but yeah, that is something to think about. That is a good point. Yes.
Alice, I just wanted to say that after emancipation, when people bought small plots of land, very often one of the big motivators was so you could have a cemetery and put your people close to you and know where they were and be able to protect that space. So if you have a 5-acre plot of land and you are putting a house on it and a garden and a cemetery, yes, I would say it's very common. And on Woodburn Road, when they were also looking into that for the bypass, these very small plots of land, very many of them had small backyard cemeteries very close to the house with grave markers. So I would say the concerns about, sanitary burials probably were way not in anybody's game plan to worry about. The important thing was having your family close by and being able to also garden. Thank you.
No, that's a great point, Allison. I mean, it is, it's a little scary how many of these cemeteries there were, that there had to have been, that we don't necessarily know about. You wonder when you see, you see a place being clear cut or you see development occurring. I'm not anti-development. People have to have places to live and whatnot, but there's a lot of history, and there's probably a lot of sites like that out there that, there's not just some master list somewhere that we can all just run and reference. There's a lot of smaller lists, and they're all very incomplete if a particular cemetery is even on a list.
Erik, I'm going to just jump in for a second.
Yeah.
As I see that more and more people are leaving, as Erik continues the question, I'm going to launch a poll. If you could just give us some brief feedback on today's session, we would truly appreciate it. So I'm going to launch the poll, but Erik, keep going and answering those questions, please.
Cool. Thank you, Sue. So the Ramona asks, does the community or neighborhood have a name where the original landowners of the site where the Cho Airport is located? Yes, so that is, so that area is mostly known as, the community is known as Ravana. Not entirely sure where that name actually came from, because it is such a fairly generalized name, but yeah, that was known as the community of Ravana, and it included Pleasant Grove Church, which you may remember used to be kind of overlooking the airport or the airfield or the landing runway. Next to, there's that beautiful gigantic tree. It's actually talking about with Karen earlier, and there used to be a church there that was taken down to make way for the expansion of the runway. There was also a school in there at one point in the past. So that was its own little vibrant community, and yeah, it is unfortunate. I mean, part of it is now underneath the runway, underneath the traffic circle. When you drive through there, and there has been, I know there's been research done on that. There was quite a bit done, I think, when the church itself was slated for removal. I know, I mean, probably the easiest thing is if you Google Pleasant Grove Baptist Church. I mean, you'll find their website, of course, but you'll also find some, I think you'll probably find I know you'll find other resources as well, kind of describing a little more the history of the area. But that's another place, I mean, especially as there's so much development occurring kind of leading up to the airport, back there around the Hollymead Town Center and Berkmar Drive extended. There's a lot of people used to live back in there, and there's a lot of development occurring now. There's a question about dates of identifiable invasive plants. I'm sorry, Karen, if you want to jump in, please be my guest, but okay, she said, yeah, that might be something we're not sure about. That is outside of my expertise. I'm sorry. So I don't know. So what crops did they grow and sell? Like I say, you can see what looks like corn in that one image. And Manfred mentions, I think, corn and watermelon and squash and tomatoes. I believe Hugh Carr also grew tobacco at one point. I'm not sure what else we know. And I don't know, Alice, is that something you know more about?
I think part of what Conley Greer did was raise a lot of vegetables that he actually took to Albemarle Training School. He shared it with the people there. I'm not sure that we know very much about how he marketed things. He was instrumental in helping to create cooperatives for other farmers to share goods, but I have no idea whether he used them himself. I think that mostly we have to look at Ivy Creek Farm as a demonstration farm, rather than as a farm where he was really earning his money buying and selling those things. He did also have something that we're not seeing, which is he had cattle and he had dairy cows. So the barn was a dairy, basically a dairy farm. So for milking cows and, chickens, huge raising of chickens there, from eggs and hatching them. And so I think that there, all of those things, we don't really understand the markets, but it was like most of the different crops in this area, it was very varied. It was not a monoculture like rice farming or corn that you would have now, or even cattle. It was a little bit of everything, and trying to see what would grow best in different areas, as well as orchard.
Awesome, thank you. I'm sorry, someone
Karen,
else?
I just want to jump in and say, if some of you have not seen the Ivy Creek website, the Ivy Creek Foundation website, some of these questions are definitely answered there. Very well put together and covers and is quite comprehensive, although new history is being picked up every year, thanks to the diligence of everyone working. So just don't forget to look at the website actually and cruise around for some answers to these things. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Karen. And yeah, when you go up near the top, there's I think there's actually a heading for Riverview Farm, and you go in there and there's just a ton of information on the genealogy, some of the different family members. Talks about the community of Hydraulic, where the mills were, the background of Hugh Carr and whatnot. It's a really well done website. We also, through there, if you, under that section, you'll see a link for what's called story maps. And that's a set of interactive maps that I've put together in coordination with the foundation. And if you go and find that story map link, you can explore a little bit on your own. You can kind of pan and zoom and play around with some of the historic imagery and turn on and off the different data layers and things like that. So look for the story mapping link. There's a question: how extensively has the Carr-Greer descendant community been involved in this work? I don't know, Alice or Dee Dee, would you like to field that one?
Yeah, I'll field it. It's Dee Dee here. Yes, I mean, the Ivy Creek Foundation has been both very active with the descendant community, but also very lucky in that from the get-go, from the very first transfer from the descendant of Mary Carr and Conley Greer to ongoing, that we have been involved with the family. The family has different generations have shown different interests. I think you have to be a little careful when you talk about the descendant community, in the sense that assuming that all the descendant community really wants to be involved. There is nobody who is still locally here. But we have hosted reunions. We are, regularly in contact with not only Manfred Jones, who you mentioned came to visit, but his sister, Theodosia, actually lived in the house for 12 years. And she, although she's not well enough, she's in her 80s, and to come here from Florida, she has is very interested and has really told us lots and lots of information about that house. So we've been really lucky. And, you know, of course, the Hawkins, who are descended from the Hugh Carr's wife's Texie Mae Hawkins, we hosted their reunion. We helped them research their history. So I think as much as we can, we have involved and have benefited from it. It's not just, oh, we should do this. It's that it is incredibly beneficial to get the resources, not only in memory, but in photos from them. And we just, as I say, have been lucky in that sense.
Great, thank you, Dee Dee. I'm not sure about a kitchen garden near the house. Alice, do you know anything? Would there have been a separate garden maybe that they would have
I
used?
just think that when you talked about the corn, the area in between the corn and the house would have been what you would, I think, call the kitchen garden. I think that would be more the vegetables that were used. And the story that, you know, Evangeline said, which is Mary Carr Greer and Conley Greer's daughter, which was that her mother would look out and see her father's lantern coming through the field after he'd worked in the garden in the dark and put dinner on the table. So that was the garden right behind the house, in between that whole garden area. So you had the overview slide of the cornfield, and then the next part that you spoke of, the melons and the other things, which would have had all the things they would have used.
Oh, great. Thank you. I think that's about it. Right, so some of Hugh Carr's first purchases, yes, Steve shared part of Nathaniel Burnley's hydraulic plantation. So he owned the mills and that area, and he was a prolific landowner in the era leading up to the Civil War, which just make it difficult to research his holdings because there were so many. Again, yeah, I think the Ivy Creek website would be an excellent starting point for additional research. Also, you know, anyone is welcome to contact me. I'd love to talk more. My email is just my last name, irtenkauf@gmail.com. So pretty easy to remember. Or
Erik, could you put it in the chat for everybody?
Oh, that would make sense, wouldn't it? Yes, I will do that. And then other than that, I think, thank you, Lorna. She's been adding some additional information, and Edwina also. So the Albemarle Training School, which was for a time known as the Union Ridge Graded School, is actually next to where the trailer park is today. It's, I think it's like Court Square title is there now. So if you're, yeah, so if you're driving from, you know, if you're driving to the intersection with Union Ridge Baptist, it's there on the right-hand side. There's some big trees and the evergreens in the front along the road, and it. But yeah, I think it's a title, it's Court Square title, but that's where the school was.
Can I note too, Erik, that there's a historic marker that is just about to go up. The post is in, I think even as early as this Friday for the Albemarle Training School. So it'll be much more obvious where it is. And there's a little industrial area there. Is that industrial, retail or whatever? And the one of those buildings, the white building, there's a white building with a brick addition. The white building is original to Albemarle Training School. Another history that we have been very involved with that descendant community. And it's a really, really interesting story. It's basically the Jefferson School of the county, if anybody wants to know what it is. So it's, watch for that.
No, that's awesome. That's great to hear. And actually, if you search for Albemarle Training School, the UVA Special Collections Library has a blog. I can't remember the name, but it'll if you search for Albemarle Training School, it'll pop up. Literally just a few days ago, I think they had an article that shares some pictures and resources from in their collection about Albemarle Training School. And there's some just really phenomenal photos in there that I had never seen. So if you're and there's some information as well on the Ivy Creek website. So if you start with those things and start pulling threads, there's a lot of information out there, and it really is that itself is an amazing story.
Yeah, I just want to add that we have a link to that blog post on our Facebook page.
Oh, there you go. Awesome. Yeah, it was really, really a great article. Did the African-American property owners willingly sell their land for development? That I'm sure it was a mixed bag. I mean, I know that, so there's this awesome newspaper article it was in the Daily Progress in 1985, and it's down in the flat files preserved at the Historical Society. If you go down there, I think it's in their folder for, I think it's probably churches, or maybe it's Union Ridge Baptist Church if they have a folder there. And it's this article from I think 1985, and it talks about like the changing face of the Union Ridge area and all the development that was occurring. Say it's so recent, it's still under copyright. Like I would love to just put it out there because it's full of so many wonderful quotes from residents of the community, kind of who remembered it in these earlier times. You know, talks about living in Cartersburg, which is the community there on Woodburn Drive, and driving their horse and buggy into town to get vegetables for their mother, or talks about the farms and how the how all the fields and the springs had names and things like that. But one of the things the article does say is that in a lot of cases people would move away. I mean, kids would kids want to move away. Not everybody wants to farm, so there is just sort of this kind of natural progression over time to there's just not always people there to maintain the farms. I'm sure some of it there was some pressure. I don't know. I'm just speculating on that end. And I don't know if anybody else, if Alice or Dee Dee or any any stories or can add some insight on that.
I can't say as I do, other than if you look at the Carr Greer situation, the last descendant, basically. I mean, not, and I don't include the Hawkins here, but immediate descendant, lived in Nashville, and there just was nobody left to inherit the property. And but I have no idea if that's emblematic of other properties.
So I think that one of the things that is actually different about Hugh Carr's land is that was a big piece of land, as Erik pointed out. He was one of the largest landowners in the area. So many pieces of land were very small, and that African Americans and young white farmers and old white farmers bought after emancipation when the plantations broke up. Very often they were not good pieces of land for farming. So if you go on Woodburn Road behind the Royal Hills Shopping Center, you will see that the pieces of land that African American farmers bought at that point were like 5 acres going down the slope to the river. And it was almost impossible to farm on that land. And if you had 5 acres and you had 5 children and you subdivided it and you subdivided it again, eventually you either have to buy more land to even do a very minimal garden, or you just kind of decide it was very hard. So Albemarle County is not good farming land. Most people will kind of come to that. That's why you have a lot of horses grazing and cows grazing, and not a lot of, very intensive farming going on here. It's always been a difficult land to farm. Even Thomas Jefferson found that. So you can just understand that. I think at a certain point, people like Mary Carr Greer's sisters became teachers and moved into towns, and moved into different places. They didn't want to farm. The one thing that always strikes me is how happy Hugh Carr must have been that Mary Carr Greer married a farmer who wanted to farm. She must have made the old man very happy when she brought Conley Greer to the Riverview farm to meet him. Because that was the way that the farm went on. And Mary Carr Greer couldn't have done it herself. She was a teacher like her siblings. So I think there's just a lot of that happens. I think also land got very got sold for back taxes after people moved away, and then developers snapped it up. So I think there are lots of different reasons, but I don't think anybody would have been happy about leaving their land, but I certainly think that they would have had economic pressures trying to keep farming it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, one of the really interesting things about the Riverview Farm Ivy Creek story is how the land was divided after Hugh Carr's death among his children, and over the years, Conley Greer and Mary Carr Greer reassembled a lot of the farm by repurchasing from their siblings, and were able to put together. I think I'm not sure if it was all of it or almost all of it, but yeah, I mean, they didn't have the same interest in farming either. So thank you. Yes, someone added, yeah, George Yates, one of the African-American farmers with Conley Greer. His property is still in the Yates family, and yes, his granddaughter is on Zoom. I won't spotlight her or call her out, but yes, she unless she wants to speak, but she is here, and she actually yes, provided some really nice context and background information when I was originally researching the locations of those farms. So I think we made it through all the questions. I did put my email in there. I sent it when I first promised to, but I direct messaged it to somebody. So sorry, I thought that was out there, but it's in there now. Please feel free to contact me. Love to talk more. And again, if there's any other questions, now would be the time probably.
Eric, one last thing from the question that John Scrivani just put in. The Millers still live in Earlysville on portions of their farm. I'd like to just say that there's a panel that's going to go up in the barn on the pigs in the barn, which were Horace Miller's pigs. So the pigs that Horace Miller's, the tour that you included was Horace Miller. His nephew had pigs in the barn with Mary Carr Greer. And so that we'll have an explanatory panel going up on that. Sorry to interrupt. Thank you.
That's great.
I would like to again thank Erik so much. Give you a virtual round of applause. Thank you so much. It was fantastic. We really appreciate all of you spending Valentine's Day with us. I'd also like to thank all the wonderful people who put this together, especially Chris Myers, Catherine Boston, Rochelle Garwood, Lorna, all the folks and wonderful people on the education committee who work tirelessly on Ivy Talks. Thank you so much. Please make sure that you follow us through our newsletter And if you're interested in the next Ivy Talk, here's the commercial. It will be about bluebirds and bringing them back, and registration is now open on our website. So please go to that and register. That's 1 month from today on March 14th. And if you enjoy this program and other things that the foundation does for our community, please consider becoming a donor and a member today by going to our website and hitting that donate button and showing us how much you love us. We would appreciate that. So thanks again to Erik, and thank you everyone. We are recording. We'll upload this to everyone on our YouTube site in the next couple of days, and be safe and be well. Thank you and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, everybody.